Welcome to the Holy Post. Theologian and writer Esau McCaulley is back to talk about his new memoir, How Far to the Promised Land? One black family's story of hope and survival in the American South. He says there is grace in learning to tell the complicated facets of his family's story rather than reducing it to a single story about race, poverty, or just trauma. McCaulley believes that's a lesson we need to apply to America's story as well. Also this week, David Brooks writes about the courage and wisdom of three women during World War II. What do their stories tell us about the Christian life today? Plus, why are men thinking so much about the Roman Empire? And a three-legged bear walks into a bar. As always, there's a lot going on beyond just today's episode. This week, we've released our first episode of a new sub-series, Why I'm Still a Christian. This first episode features Lecrae, and you don't want to miss it. And for our Holy Post Plus subscribers, Phil is hosting a live stream with Old Testament scholar Dr. John Walton, where you can ask him all of your Bible questions directly. And of course, there's new episodes of Getting Schooled by Caitlin Chess and Christian Asks. Go to holypost.com to access all of our content and to learn how you can sign up to become a Holy Post Plus subscriber. Here is episode 583.
Hey there, welcome back to the podcast. This is Holy Post Podcast. I'm Phil Vischer. I'm here with Christian Taylor. Hi, Christian.
Hey, Phil.
And Sky Jatani.
Hi, Phil.
Jatani, that's how they would introduce you if you hosted a game show. Then you'd come running out.
Yeah.
Sky Jatani!
Yeah.
Or they could say, come on down, like The Price is Right, if I was a contestant.
Yeah.
Sky Jatani, come on down!
You're the next contestant on The Price is Right. Okay. Christian, where have you been? Anywhere? Last 2 weeks?
I was taking care of my daddy in Madison, Mississippi.
Oh, okay. You were in Mississippi.
Yeah.
Mississippi, M-I-S.
Who I never want to tell I'm from Mississippi anymore, so very sad to say that.
We won't talk about that right now. Okay, here's the theme song.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian.
Today's episode of the Holy Post is sponsored by Magic Spoon. What's that? Let me explain. I got a box in the mail from a new company that wanted to sponsor the podcast. I opened it up and it was full of breakfast cereal. I like breakfast cereal, but the box said this cereal had 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, and 4 to 5 net grams of carbs. It's high protein, no sugar, keto-friendly, gluten-free, grain-free, and soy-free. And I thought, oh no, this is going to taste like packing peanuts. So I poured myself a small bowl of the peanut butter flavor and gave it a try. And the next thing I said was, Lisa, you got to come try this. And she said, wow, that's really good. But then our 6-year-old granddaughter, Marley, came over, so we had her test it. She tried all 4 flavors that come in the variety pack: cocoa, fruity, frosted, and peanut butter. And then she wanted to eat more. She liked them so much, she asked if she could take the whole box back to her house. Seriously, Magic Spoon cereal, only 140 calories a serving, and it tastes really good. You got to check this out. So go to magicspoon.com/Holy Post to grab a variety pack and try it today. And be sure to use our promo code HOLYPOST at checkout to save $5 off your order. And Magic Spoon is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you don't like it for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember, get your next delicious bowl of high-protein cereal at magicspoon.com/Holy Post and use the code HOLYPOST to save $5 off. And thank you to Magic Spoon for surprising me and for sponsoring this episode. I'm back. We're back. Sky would like me to ask him if he went anywhere. Sky, did you go anywhere last week?
Yes, Phil.
Where'd you go?
I was in Big Sky, Montana.
What? What were you doing in Big Sky, Montana?
There was a fundraiser for an organization that I used to be on the board of, and I was kindly invited to be a participant. But I had never been to Montana. I think there are only now 3 states to which I have never traveled.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
But what a beautiful place. Absolutely stunningly
I
beautiful
love
place.
it there. I love it there.
Does it have?
It earns its name.
Yeah. Does it have Big Sky? Is there Big Sky?
It has Big Sky, big mountains, big trees, big animals, big everything.
And big, vistas. Like you just feel like you can see forever.
What big animals did you see?
Oh, I didn't see any.
Well, how do you know it has
except
them?
because there's elk and buffalo, and it's real close to Yellowstone. Although I didn't have time to actually go to Yellowstone.
There's
I was
bears
actually
there.
I was with Glenn Packiam, our Holy Post pundit, was there, so that was fun to see him and his wife, and my wife was with me. It was really nice.
Oh, nice. So you can all your kids are out of the house now, right?
No,
No,
we
not
have
Lucy.
no. She's a sophomore.
Right.
So
That's right. I'm sorry.
we abandoned her back in Wheaton, and we went to Montana.
Did you send her to your mother's, or did you just say you're on your own?
No, my mother came to her.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
You can't leave high schoolers solo.
No.
That's a recipe for a John Hughes movie.
I don't know what you're talking about. I completely trust my high schoolers
Yeah.
and never had any problems with them
Okay.
ever.
Speaking of not trusting high school behavior and large mammals, a three-legged bear breaks into a Florida home and drinks White Claw hard seltzer.
Oh, this is going to be great.
Yeah,
Okay.
apparently the three-legged bear, that's every great joke starts with, a three-legged bear walked into
a bar.
Yeah. A three-legged bear known as Tripod, so it has a nickname. Boy, that's a...
This must be a bear that frequents the neighborhood.
Yes, that's a really clever nickname for a three-legged bear. You guys have outdone yourselves. A three-legged bear known as Tripod broke into a lanai over the weekend and decided to have a party. He walked in, he scratched his way through the screened-in porch. He took 3 White Claws, drank, and left very happy, the homeowner said.
That's funny because he only has 3 claws.
Oh, he has more than 3 claws. He has 3 paws.
He only has 3
He has
legs.
3 paws. He has more than 3
They're
claws. A paw is not a claw.
Whatever. So-
Good.
He was
Similar.
being
You know what I mean.
funny. Give him a break.
You need to go back to Montana and look at the mammals and check their feet. Or just look at Steve. Does Steve have 3 claws, Sky?
He has more than 3.
Okay. Okay. The homeowner...
I have a.
Yes, the homeowner declared that Tripod's favorite flavor is the mango and strawberry.
There's mango strawberry.
Apparently. I don't know.
I don't drink White Claws. I don't know what their flavors are.
I'm really, really curious as to why this bear chose those. Was it a visual thing? Like, did he say, "Ooh, these cans look really cool, so
Yeah.
there's got to be something in there"? Or was it their size? Or were they the only 3 things in the fridge?
Right.
Well-
That is interesting. We did a story, I don't know, last year about a bear that drank a whole 12-pack of light beer or something at a campsite. We were thinking, how does a bear do that? And it just kind of crunched up all the cans. So drinking might be a misnomer. I do wonder if this bear just crunched up the cans or if he used one of his 3 claws to pull open the little pop top and threw it back.
And throw it back.
Yeah. Then there's the cocaine bear. You know the story of the cocaine bear, right?
You know what? I don't know the story of the cocaine bear.
Yeah, well, it's a movie. It's an exciting movie where a bear comes across some cocaine and gets high and goes on a rampage because he wants more and more coke. A coke-addled bear, and it's kind of a horror slash comedy.
That would be a horror.
But it's
horror
based on a
show.
true story with a much less interesting conclusion because there was a case where smugglers had dumped a pack of cocaine that someone was going to pick up, and a bear found it first, ate the cocaine, and died. Less funny.
That is less funny.
Less funny.
Kind of sad, actually.
So what happened to Tripod?
He just wandered away. Just wandered away. Have you ever been to the Country Bear Jamboree at Disney World or Disneyland?
Yeah.
I don't think they have that anymore.
I think
They
still
do. They're actually they just announced a rehab.
Yeah,
They're
gonna do new
redoing
songs.
it, updating it.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm so
Yeah.
shocked.
I think the Blood on the Saddle song is just disturbing too many modern children. So maybe, because those bears seem a little bit intoxicated.
True.
Don't they serve alcohol at Disney World now?
Yeah.
I think you have to be intoxicated to actually enjoy that.
The Country Bear Jamboree. It would probably help. Like being
It would help.
being high on Small World. Oh, not that I've done that, because I haven't.
Is getting back to the bear,
Yeah.
is there any backstory on how Tripod lost a leg, or was that
No, he
unknown?
won't tell people. He's a little embarrassed. He says the story reflects poorly on his judgment, so he's not going to share it with humans.
It was probably a trap.
But if we
they
can-
were trying to trap
If
him.
we could find his wife, I'm sure she would love to tell us how it happened. Oh, honey, let me tell you what happened. It's the greatest story. Okay, how often do men think about ancient Rome? Quite frequently, it seems. A new social media trend prompting women to ask the men in their lives how often they think about ancient Rome reveals that it crosses the minds of many men on a weekly basis or even daily, to the surprise and confusion of their spouses.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, one woman's fiance on a TikTok video said 3 times a day and explained, "There's so much to think about." They built an entire world-dominating society, another man exclaimed when asked by a bewildered-looking woman to justify why he contemplates ancient Rome so frequently. So this has been going around Twitter now with women asking their husbands, how often do you think about ancient Rome? And almost universally being surprised at the frequency.
I kind of understand if you're a Christian who reads the Bible regularly, because Rome comes up a lot in the New Testament.
But when you think about ancient Rome, you're not really thinking about the house church in Ephesus.
no, but I'm trying to understand why. I'm thinking about why I think about
First,
Rome,
okay.
and I usually think about Rome in a theological or biblical context. But why do non-Christian, non-Bible reading people think about Rome so
Would
much?
you say, Sky, you think about ancient Rome daily,
No.
weekly,
Yeah.
fortnightly?
But again, it's because I'm engaged
Yeah,
in Scripture all the
okay.
time.
Outside of the context of the Bible, how often do you think about ancient Rome?
Very rarely.
How often do you find yourself saying, I wish I was wearing a toga right now?
Never.
I wish I could go to the vomitorium.
Yeah. No.
It doesn't happen. Okay, Christian.
What about you? You're a man. Do you think about Rome?
No, I don't think about ancient Rome at all. No. If I
Interesting.
listen to Mike Erie's podcast and he's going through Revelation, which he's doing currently, and he can't stop talking about historical context, then I find myself thinking a lot about ancient Rome. Christian, so we're not interested if you think about ancient Rome, because that's not the
Okay.
point. That is not the point of the story. How often do you think Jeremy thinks about ancient Rome? And can you
Probably rarely, if never.
really? I think
Yes.
maybe we should find out if you know him as well as you think you know him. Maybe
I was actually thinking I was going to ask him when I got off this
you could
podcast.
text him while we're on the podcast,
Ooh,
and by
I
the
will do
end
that.
of the podcast, you'll have the answer. Just say,
I'll do that.
honey. How often do you think
But-
about ancient Rome?
Is this like some kind of weird, I don't know what it would be, Pavlovian thing, where now that I've learned this, am I going to be thinking about ancient Rome?
Oh, maybe.
Because it's now whenever Rome does come to mind, I'm going to think, how do I stop thinking about Rome? It's like,
Do you think?
how do you tell?
Do
Go
you
ahead.
think ancient Rome just feels like the pinnacle of masculinity? You know, with all these gladiators and Trojans and all these guys and the hats and the swords and marching around conquering, and that we don't have a whole lot of opportunity to conquer anymore other than playing video games. So are men just thinking about the good old days of conquering?
I don't, maybe, but Rome, biblically speaking, Rome is the kind of, it epitomizes empire, worldly
Right.
empire, and not in a good way.
We want to be
That's
in
why-
charge of everything.
Yeah, and so I think it probably feeds into the very sinful, domineering instinct of humans, maybe particularly men, and so Rome becomes this.
Okay. So
Icon
you're
for
saying
it.
the more a man thinks about Rome, the more sinful he is.
Yes, clearly.
Okay. Christian?
So I have some theories.
Okay, good.
First,
Go.
first of all, interestingly, I think about Rome often, more often than you would imagine. And I think it comes from loving history, first of all. And when I was in 5th grade, I was captivated by Pompeii and everything that was happening, in that kind of ancient Italy area. But also like all of our philosophy kind of goes back to that time period, right? Just like in Rome when there were so many, not all of it goes back to there, but
the Greeks probably a little more
right.
so.
The antiquity, if you will.
Yes. And I've been reading the Stoics, and there's a lot of Stoic philosophy kind of going around now. And so, I think it's kind of baked into our stories, right? We end up talking about ancient Rome or myths of Greek mythology, often in kind of culture. So
I just think most American men have watched the movie Gladiator a few too many times. And
Probably.
it just keeps popping into our minds.
But like, for a long time, Braveheart was a hugely popular movie among Christian men's ministries, and there's all the, the nonsense that went on with Mark Driscoll
Yep.
claiming to be William Wallace II or whatever, and the crazy stuff he wrote. But like, as far as I know, like Christian men are not thinking all the time about medieval Scotland. So why are they thinking so much about ancient Rome?
I don't know, but I have an answer from my husband.
Oh, what did he say?
He says, how often I think about ancient Rome? Rarely. I mean, when I watch Gladiator, yes.
There you go.
But otherwise, not. Note that when I travel to Italy, I never go to Rome. There you go.
Does he go to Italy regularly?
He does go often. He works for a company, and they have companies over there. So
Okay.
there you go. From our small survey, though, from the 3 men we've surveyed during this podcast, it sounds like the only person that really thinks about Rome is the woman.
We are not winning the TikTok challenge. Have you ever, Sky, have you ever engaged in a TikTok challenge? Have you ever done anything because TikTok told you to do it?
My kids have tried to get me to do things that are TikTok related, but I don't know if I actually
did. They ever ask you to do the dancing ones?
Oh yeah, but it's not pretty.
But
those are my favorite.
But did it happen?
I don't know, and if it did, it needs to be scrubbed from the internet immediately.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, on a more serious note, David Brooks has a new book coming out, which sounds like this article is pulled from the work he's doing for the new book. He wrote a piece in, what's the name of the journal, the magazine? Comment? I've never heard of that. Comment Magazine. Do you subscribe? Anyone?
Yeah,
Nope.
It's actually really good.
I have not heard of
You
it.
get Comment Magazine? Is it an actual printed magazine?
Yes, it is a printed magazine.
Wow.
And it's very thoughtful content.
It's weird that there's still magazines that are on paper.
I know.
I just got Car and Driver today, so clearly there are.
Do you subscribe to Car and Driver?
I don't know how it ends up showing up at my house. I have
Christian,
no idea.
Christian, we need to talk because you're getting Car and Driver and you think about Rome a lot.
I know. I don't know what's happening to me.
Okay. The feminine way to wisdom. That sounds offensive already, doesn't it?
Not to me.
He's writing about the feminine way to wisdom. And he's talking about 3 women that he's studied that all died around the time of World War II. All 3 were Jewish. 2 actually died in the Holocaust. The other died of tuberculosis later on in the war. Eddie Hillesum, Edith Stein, and Simone Weil.
Weil,
I'm going with Weil. Eddie Hillesum, Edith Stein, and Simone Weil. They were all raised in Jewish families, and 2 at least, and maybe all 3 of them, converted to Catholicism later in life and became sort of spiritually more mystical. 2 were intellectuals, started out intellectual, and then moved more and more towards a Catholic tradition. Edith Stein actually became a Carmelite nun, spent the rest of her life as a Carmelite nun until she was sent to Auschwitz, I believe. So here's what I wrote down. It's like 30 pages long when I printed it out anyway. 30 pages long, so it's not short, but
it's worth the read. It's so
totally
well
worth
done.
the read.
It is worth the read. He starts out by describing the spiritual transformation of Eddie Hillesum, who started out very kind of self-absorbed and depressive, and then ended up giving her life completely to help others in the depths of the Holocaust. He says, I'm transfixed by the spiritual transformation that Eddie Hillesum experienced. The horror of the Holocaust made some people passive and afraid. It made others bitter and ruthless. But Eddie went from being a highly self-absorbed and critical person to being a selfless and generous person. As the environment grew more wretched, she became more tranquil and more radiant. Her biographer says something interesting about this transformation. Her biographer says, it was her practice of paying deep attention which transformed her. Eddie possessed what her biographer called an acute perceptiveness. Once she freed herself from her obsession with self, she was able to see other people in minute detail. She enveloped people in a loving gaze, a visual embrace that not only helped her feel what others were experiencing, but also gave those around her the sense that she was right there with them. She was determined not to be numbed by the cruelty, but to go on seeing. And this is kind of the theme of the article, and I think his upcoming book is this seeing of perceptiveness of not being self-focused, but actually seeing individuals, other people. So he says, as you look deeper into the lives of Hillesum, Stein, and Weil, you begin to appreciate that attention is a moral act. Maybe the primary moral act. The quality of attention you bring to the world determines what you see in the world and ultimately what you do in the world. She who only looks inward will only find chaos. She who looks outward with the eyes of critical judgment will only find flaws. But she who looks with the eyes of compassion and understanding will see complex souls suffering and soaring, navigating life as best they can. And if she sees others rightly, with the eyes of reverence, she will begin to treat others differently with generosity and understanding. And then Brooks kind of summarizes his observation of these three women, says, these three women changed the way they saw the people around them and were transformed. Or perhaps to put it more accurately, the Holy Spirit entered into each of their lives and they saw the people around them by the light of that illumination. That's interesting. Because David Brooks has
I loved it.
kind of been on a spiritual journey himself over the last 5 or 10 years.
And we had him on the show. I don't know what episode that was to talk about some of that. But it's a profoundly biblical theme, to see with new eyes. I mean, even the hymn Amazing Grace,
Yep.
I once was blind, but now I see. Like that whole idea of seeing the world differently is so deep. And when you compare these three stories of the women that Brooks outlines here, and you recognize their behavior so much like Jesus, who came into the world and saw the people that others ignored, or the invisible. He gave dignity to them by recognizing them, acknowledging them. There's so many stories of people, like Bartimaeus is one, who was literally blind, but if you remember, Jesus going by, Bartimaeus hears that he's there and he starts shouting, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And the crowd tells him to shut up and kind of push him aside, but Jesus acknowledges him and brings him forward. There's story after story of people who are invisible, marginalized, pushed to the periphery, whom Jesus acknowledges and sees and gives the dignity of his attention to, which then the apostles carry out later on in the mission of the church. And that's a marker of God's work in the world. Yeah. And that's what you see in these three women. It's just remarkable.
I love this part that exemplifies exactly what you just said. David Brooks says, once she freed herself from her obsession of self, she was able to see other people in minute detail, observing one person's rigid neck, another's hungry look, another's fearful eyes. She enveloped people in a loving gaze, a visual embrace that not only helped her feel what others were experiencing, but also gave those around her the sense that she was right there with them. I mean, that's Jesus embodied,
right? Right. So Brooks says, moral life, and I think what he's pursuing, and this may be the quest that he's been on for a while, is what is a good life? That's something that Willard and others wrote extensively about. And we, as philosophers, we're trying to define what makes a life worth living. How do we define what a good life is? And we tend to come up with so many shallow answers to that question that lead to shallow lives and shallow society. David Brooks says, moral life is not just making heroic acts of self-sacrifice at the epic key moments of life. Moral life goes on continually in the small moments the small moment-by-moment acts of trying to cast a just and loving regard onto others. To see well, we have to lay aside the egotistical, insecure, and self-serving lenses that most of us habitually use to construct comfortable versions of the world. So what we have here is a different version of what the good life looks like, a version built on the seemingly simple act of seeing. And this is interesting because where he goes with it, then he says, I have two questions. The first question is, does it matter that the three thinkers I've described here were women? And the whole issue of comment, I guess, is about gender. So that's the theme he's looking at here. Does it matter and then the second question he asks is, does it matter, is it relevant that the three women I'm talking about were raised in Jewish homes that come from Jewish families? So on the women notion, he says, and this is where you start to tense up, say, wait a minute, everybody's the same. We're all the same. It doesn't make any difference. Does it matter that the three thinkers I've described here were women? Brooks says, I think it does. Over the centuries, male writers and philosophers have built these vast moral systems that portray moral life as something that disinterested, rational individuals do by adhering to abstract universal principles. So he's saying that male philosophers have developed a system of just abstracting everything to the highest, broadest principles. Over the long course of Western civilization, it's fair to say that men have been trained to think in this abstract, domineering way, to start from first principles to lay down laws. Meanwhile, these same men have often been blind to the networks of care right around them. Women, through most of Western history, have, on the other hand, been charged with running these networks of care. So in many cases, through history, men were off thinking great and grand thoughts in academia and in temples and in towers, and women were actually taking care of people. Mother Teresa, the Carmelite nuns, you just go back through history, and women have often been the ones face to face with the suffering, where, unfortunately, men were often in rooms by themselves plotting how to bring about more suffering, planning wars and such things.
Right. And that's where this is, not to get into the gender theory stuff too much, but there is an instinct to hyper masculinize God. And maybe in a reaction, there's a tendency to hyper feminize God in certain traditions as well. But you see both of these qualities in the God of Scripture. There is the abstraction and principle. The Ten Commandments is abstraction.
Mm-hmm.
Do not commit murder, do not commit, that's abstraction. But then you see the deep particularity in Jesus, where he has compassion and love towards particular individuals facing, extreme moments or challenges. And that's why male and female are created in the image of God.
Yeah.
We need each other in that.
Yeah. So as if that wasn't a little dicey, the second question, does it matter that all three were born Jews? In the first place, he says, because they were living in World War II in Europe, they were thrust into a circumstance of unfathomable moral intensity. So you're in that circumstance. Who was up to it more in moral questions and moral intensity than Jewish families living in Europe in World War II? Furthermore, thousands of years ago, Jews were a small, insignificant people living in a marginal part of the world, and yet they believed that God had centered history on them. It was an audacious conviction, and that notion has come down to Jews ever since in the form of a related responsibility to live life as an audacious moral journey. And then he goes on to say, most importantly, to be steeped in the Torah is to be steeped in particularity. It is a sacred book about particular humans, Abraham, Isaac, Sarah, in a particular place at a particular time. The abstract laws and commandments are incarnated in particular stories that often defy expectations or generalizations. So he believes the fact that these three women are women is relevant because there's more of a tradition in the West of women in running systems of care and looking people in the eyes that are suffering. And that the fact that they were Jews, he thinks, is relevant because of the Jewish tradition of believing you have an audacious conviction that you're on a moral journey called by God. And other people's haven't had quite that same conviction. And then a particularity of the Torah, and just the particularity of, our holy book, is it's stories about people. It's not just, God could have given us a book of philosophical thoughts or, like Platonic verse. But that's not what we got. We got stories about people that in many cases are all mixed up and screwy like we are. So that particularity of the Jewish tradition and Hebrew scripture and the running systems of care that women got assigned to in Europe through traditions, he believes created what these three women are, which are women who felt called by God to see people in their suffering and be present with them. And he concludes the whole article by saying, war is dehumanizing, and a war launched in part to exterminate an entire people is the most dehumanizing form of war imaginable. In the face of this onslaught, the most heroic and vital response is this one: I will see you. I will see you as the infinitely valuable and non-repeatable person that you are. I will see you whole. Okay, and that, that's relevant to World War II and learning about World War II, in history. But it's so relevant in how we think about immigrants, in how we think about the poor, in how we think about the people on the other side of the culture wars. Because whenever there's a war, even if it's just a culture war, it's not a shooting war. We're just culture warring. We're always susceptible to dehumanizing our opponents, and you see that so much on Twitter.
Well, you kind of have to. If you're going to use the war rhetoric and the war mindset, then you have to in some way diminish the value of those you are opposing in order to dominate them.
Yeah.
And that's why you've already lost. From a Christian point of view, the moment you frame something as a war that must be won at all costs, you've already lost, because you've dehumanized and violated the very central calling of our faith, to love your neighbor.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about stories even in World War II, like the story of the men on the Western Front on Christmas Eve who decided to take a pause and come out and sing Christmas hymns together.
Wasn't that World War I?
Was it World War I? Okay, World War I.
I think it was World War I.
And how hard it is to go back to trying to kill the other guy when you just sang a Christmas carol with him because you saw him as a person for a moment. And that really messes up. What really concerns me, and this happens a lot in demagogic language and social media, is posting videos of people typically from very bad backgrounds, very harmful backgrounds, behaving poorly, and then saying, look at these animals. These animals don't deserve our respect. Whenever you've called someone an animal, that's just textbook dehumanization. You're no longer human. So we're going to treat you like an animal. And whether it's Al-Qaeda or whether it's, poor kids from the inner city that are committing a crime or looting a Walgreens, this particularity of looking them in the face and saying, I see you and I want to hear your story and I want to care about your story and I want to invest in you as a person, just makes it so hard to despise everyone.
Christian, you look like you got something to say.
Well, I am thinking about your question before, so I don't want to gloss over your point, Phil, because I think it is a very, very good point, and I think one we should all take to heart. We genuinely should never other others. But I did think the question before about, did it make a difference that they were women, or did it make a difference that they were Jews? I was thinking there was one significant piece in that article that I think all three women had in common, and that was this unbelievably powerful, sort of mystical and unexplainable conversion experience where, the Holy Spirit really, in two instances, I think, they felt compelled to their knees, and they were absolutely certain that there was a being more divine and bigger than they were. And it just called them into relationship with them. And it changed their lives. So that encounter with Christ, just like when, Paul had the same encounter with God, changed their lives, and that made a huge significant impact on why they did what they did. Not just that they were women or that they were Jews, although I agree those things did impact them, but I think it was really meeting the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, well, if you
Ultimate.
all three of them became convinced that there was something transcendent, that there was something bigger than they were, that it was God, and that they could interact with, that they could feel the presence of that transcendent spirit. And it's hard to have that experience honestly and still disregard your fellow image bearers. It's just really hard to do that. So you have to unplug some sort of connection, a connection to God, a connection to feelings, a connection to humanity, to be the kind of person who can do harm without concern.
And what I think is interesting too, like they continue to walk. Sky and I talked a little bit about this on a Christian's Ask we recorded today. But what they continued to do was walk with the God that they encountered. And they did that by embodying kind of what they felt in loving and seeing others. And that was transformative to the people that were around them wherever they were.
Yeah, that's a theme that you didn't really cover entirely on your synopsis of the article, Phil, but some of them went to, rather than having opportunities to escape from those terrible circumstances, they all moved closer to the suffering. They all chose to identify with Jews who were being rounded up into camps. They chose to return from the United States to go to Europe to be closer to the suffering in the war. They tried to intervene as much as possible in helping those who were suffering, which again, is just epitomizes the incarnation and Jesus, giving up the glories of heaven to share in our suffering and to tabernacle with us, as John says. And all of that, the recognition of the dignity of others, the willingness to share in their sufferings, to give up your comfort, and all of that is the fruit of the Spirit, which, to your point, Christian, is evidence that they had a profound encounter and communion with God.
Yeah. And I just think I was so convicted by reading this. I mean, John brought this to our attention, Phil. You decided to highlight it. And I'm so thankful. And I do hope people will take a moment. I'm sure we will link it in the comments to read this, because in reading it, I realized personally how I am so often focused on what I feel or what people are doing to me or how I look, or if I'm being successful, or if I've made a difference in the world, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I'm easily offended or hurt. And I just started realizing, like, in the bigger picture of things, it doesn't really matter. Those things don't matter. How often am I looking at these other people that are wounding me and thinking that's coming out of their own woundedness? How can I love them? I mean, that is a transcendent way to think, and it's the way Christ calls us to think. But it's here, seeing it in these examples was super convicting, and it made me want to be more like Christ in that way. So
Yeah. Last night, Lisa and I were at our little church group, and the person who was facilitating just read the verse about picking up your cross and following Jesus, and dying to yourself, and then said, "So what does that mean to you?" And it's so. I mean, you have the little pat answers that you learned growing up for what it means, but another way to view it is what happened to these three women, and that they stopped living for themselves. And it's not that they became doormats and became pushovers and so people could walk all over them. No, they became advocates for others, and they became present with others because their focus was on others. So being others focused is a form of death to self. And that's really hard. That's really hard because I'm mostly worried about me.
The beginning of it, though, is what he emphasizes in the article is that they saw people differently. They recognized the other person's thing. There's a wonderful story in Acts chapter 3 where Peter and John are going into the temple, and if you remember, there's that lame beggar who was put there every day and begging, and as they walk by, he asks them, like everyone else, for money, and everyone focuses on the fact that Peter heals the man and his legs are strengthened, and he starts dancing and celebrating in the temple. And that, of course, is a miracle and it's great. But the part that often gets overlooked is the first thing Peter says to that lame beggar is he tells him to look at us. And if you've ever been to a part of the world where there's a lot of poverty, you'll know that people begging on the streets usually have their heads down and they don't look at the people passing them by. I know this in India very well because there's such a caste system that's still there. There's a sense that if you're poor, homeless, sick on the street, there's a sense that you deserve it. And therefore you shouldn't look other people in the eye because they deserve their higher station because of their good deeds and that kind of karmic idea. So there's this lack of dignity. And this man was in this spot every day and he never looked people in the eye who were going into the temple because they were righteous and he was clearly not because of his condition. But Peter says, look at us. And by looking this man in the eye and making eye contact with him, he's restoring his dignity. He's acknowledging his humanity and his value. And that's exactly what these women did that David Brooks highlights, is they saw people in their pain and suffering and bestowed upon them the dignity of their attention and care. And in a small way, whenever we do that, we are becoming the face of God to someone else. We're acknowledging their value, and hopefully through us, they're recognizing God must care and see me as well. And that's just the beginning of our calling in Christ. And that's picking up our cross and saying, you matter as much, if not more than I do, and I will acknowledge your value and presence. And from that flows all the other healing that we can do.
Yeah.
Can I bring it down to the practical?
Yes.
Like,
and
I
then
think
we got to wrap it up because we got an interview to get to.
listening to this conversation, it's difficult, I think, to grasp onto how does this apply to me? Because looking at these women and what they did, even though it may have been small then, it sort of was on a grander scale. So how do we implement what we are talking about? And I would say, I think we need to start at home. In our closest relationships, and the people that irritate us in the way they chew, or the way they talk, or the way they snore, or whatever it is. The people that we live closest to all the time can get under our skin and irritate us. Or maybe we think that they aren't loving us enough, or spending enough time with us, or, whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. It's a great exercise, I think, to stop thinking about how that impacts us and start thinking about how can I be more loving to that person by forgetting what they're doing or erasing it. So there you go. There's my practical suggestion.
I hear you. Okay. The article's called The Feminine Way to Wisdom. I would probably name it something else, but what he's saying is we're learning from three women who can show us how to be wise, and it's in a issue of the magazine that's focused on gender. So it's in Comment Magazine. Go check it out. We'll link to it in the show notes. Hopefully someday we can have David Brooks back on to talk more about what he's been learning and how he's been pursuing the people that he's so interested in. So who is it easy for you to walk by without seeing? Think about that. Just think about it, because I'm thinking about that, because I have my whole system built for who I need to pay attention to and who I don't, and who I can not feel bad about not liking very much. So this is convicting. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Thanks for supporting us. Holy Post Plus, go to the website and check it out. Lots of good stuff posting there all the time. Our new series, Why Am I Still a Christian, just came out. First episode came out last week with today. Yeah, when did it come out? Today? Yesterday? Today. Came out today as we're recording this on Monday with Lecrae. It's a really good one. Go check it out. We have more coming. And we'll see you next time. Oh, Christian, what?
I just had a follow-up from my husband.
Yeah.
He says, and now I'm going to watch Gladiator, though.
Oh, great. At work in the middle of the day.
Look what you've started,
Look what
Phil.
we have done. All right, guys. We'll see you next week.
Bye, everybody.
This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by Hiya Health. Hey, do you have kids? Do you care about their health? Of course you do. Most kids' vitamins are basically candy in disguise, filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, unhealthy chemicals, and other gummy junk kids really shouldn't be eating. That's why Hiya was created, the pediatrician-approved, super-powered, chewable vitamin for kids. 0 sugar, 0 gummy junk, yet they taste great and are perfect for picky eaters. Hiya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's diets diets to provide the full body nourishment our kids need with a yummy taste they love. And we've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you need to go to hiyahealth.com/holypost. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to hiyahealth.com/holypost and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. And thanks to Hiya Health for sponsoring this episode. This episode is sponsored by Fabric by Gerber Life. Remember all those life insurance ads on the radio when you were a kid? Probably not, because that was for your parents to worry about. Well, guess what? Now you're the parent, and now's the time to get life insurance to help protect your family. Fabric by Gerber Life makes it quick and easy to get a high-quality policy so your family is covered. Fabric was designed by parents for parents to help you get a high-quality, surprisingly affordable term life insurance policy in less than 10 minutes. With quality policies like $1 million in coverage for less than $1 a day, you could go from start to covered in less than 10 minutes with no health exam required. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to protect their family. Apply today in just minutes at meetfabric.com/holypost. That's meetfabric.com/holypost. MEET fabric.com/holypost. Policies issued by Western Southern Life Assurance Company. Not available in certain states. Prices subject to underwriting and health questions. Thanks to Fabric by Gerber Life for sponsoring this episode.
My guest today is Esau McCaulley. He's a professor of New Testament at Wheaton College and theologian in residence at Progressive Baptist Church, a historically black congregation in Chicago. He's been on the show before to talk about his award-winning book, Reading While Black, and today we're discussing his new memoir, How Far to the Promised Land? One Black Family's Story of Hope and Survival in the American South. As you'll hear in the interview, I'm a huge fan of Esau's writing, and beyond his books, I recommend following his editorials in the New York Times. He's one of the most gifted Christian thinkers and communicators in America today, and I'm grateful to have him back on the Holy Post. Here is Esau McCaulley. All right, Esau McCaulley, welcome back to the Holy Post.
Thank you. This is like my third. I'm like a regular, aren't I?
Oh, you are a regular.
Oh, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
If I had it my way, you'd be more regular. All right, I have to make a confession as we get started.
Okay.
You're a priest. You're an Anglican priest, right?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So I'm giving you my so here's the deal.
Okay.
I really, really try to make a point of reading the books of my guests.
Okay.
As an author, I know what it's like to go on a show or a radio interview, whatever, and it's clear they didn't read the book, and it's clear that they're just using talking points and questions that were given to them by the publicist, blah, blah, blah. So I've had a super busy season with tons of interviews. Okay. And just yesterday afternoon, I finally picked up your book.
Okay.
And I thought, oh, I feel bad. I'm not going to have time to really carefully read Esau's book. I'm going to skim it. I'm going to get the gist of it. I'm going to look at it carefully.
And you fell
the gist of it. And then I'll have an informed enough set of questions that we can talk about it today in this interview.
Yes.
That is not what happened.
Oh,
and here's
what
why.
happened? Okay, what happened?
What happened is I picked up your book yesterday afternoon, and I didn't go to bed till midnight because I could not put this book down, and I read every last word of it.
Oh
and
my God.
I finished it. I took a break to have dinner with my family. It was amazing. And I say all that to tell the audience, like, this is the most beautiful book I've read this year, honestly. I read a lot of books, and they're really smart and informed, and I want people to buy all the books of the people we have on our show, but your book was really beautiful, and I am so grateful that I spent the time to read every last word of it.
That means a whole lot to me. And I'm glad that you used the word beautiful, because like one of the things that whenever you write a book, they want you to sell the book by, telling you the 5 lessons. But I really wanted to say, I just think it's a beautiful book. And is that good enough for someone to buy it? Maybe people won't buy it, but it's just like, I think it is some of the best writing I've ever done. and I'm proud of it, even if nobody else likes it. So I'm glad that you
No,
enjoy
well,
it.
I don't. You should be proud of it. It is beautifully written. I mean, it's a compelling story, and I think a lesser writer could have gotten away with still making it a compelling story. But you're a beautiful writer, and it just lifts the story up in a. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. I was telling my wife this morning because I didn't go to bed when she went to bed because I was up reading your book all night. I told her this morning. I said, "You got to read this book." Anyway, so all that to say, it's the best endorsement I could possibly give it, and I'm so grateful for it. But we got to talk about the actual content of the book.
Okay.
It's a memoir, which when this first came into my office and I saw your new book, I didn't realize it was a memoir. And it's hard to ask about a memoir without giving away
Yeah.
tons of it. But you're a young man still. I think you're 3 years younger than I am.
I'm 43.
Why did you write a Yeah, I'm 47. So
Yeah.
most 40-year-olds are not writing memoirs.
Yeah.
Why did you decide this was the moment in your life to write this?
Well, to be honest, a memoir it's not an autobiography. So it's not telling the
Right.
entirety of my life. So I'm not saying that I've lived this tremendously wise life and now I have the wisdom to pass on to the next generation. It is the story of a certain moment in my life and the way that that moment impacted everything that followed. And so the presenting issue of the book is my father was a truck driver. And when I was young, he left our family and kind of sent our family tumbling down the economic ladder. And when he was around, he was abusive and had addiction and drug issues. But in 2017, he passed away. He died on a road trip to California, far from everyone that he knew. And it quickly became clear to me that that I was going to have to do the eulogy, that my family needed me or wanted me to do the eulogy for my father. But I didn't know him very well because he had been in and out of our life. I think during my entire childhood, we never had a genuine conversation. And so anyone who's ever been a clergy person knows that when you do a eulogy, you have to kind of talk to the family. You have to understand who the person was. And if you're going to be, at least to me, a Christian leader of any kind of character, you got to tell the truth. I used to always hate the eulogies where they just turn someone they just lie. And I felt like,
Right.
I had to tell the truth. In that process of learning about my father, because he's related to me, it ended up being not just about his life, but my life. Because I wasn't just, researching some individual stranger, but I was researching my own family history. In that attempt to find some meaning in the life of someone who is fundamentally broken in a lot of ways changed me. And it changed the way that I thought about success. It changed the way that I told my own story. It changed the way that I understood a lot about America. And there are certain stories that just wouldn't let you go. They kind of stick with you. And I needed to write an ending to those stories for my own personal well-being. I needed to kind of bring closure to all of those stories that I had learned in that eulogy preparation and the aftermath. And I felt like those stories had changed me. And I was foolish enough to think that maybe those stories could do some good for other people as well. And so I wrote this book because the stories wouldn't leave me alone. And I wanted to give them to other people so they wouldn't leave them alone either. So I wanted to give you a bit of my problems, and not just my problems, the way that my family experienced life in the South, and to have that shape people's perception of the world in the way that it shaped me. So, for example, I write all of the time. I talk about race, justice, politics, religion, God, all of those things. And it comes from these formative experiences in my life. For example, having a people on both sides of my family who are tenant croppers, who are economically exploited. And that story, beyond any statistic, anything that I see in the news, shapes how I experience and see the world. I want to give those people that story because sometimes a story is more important than an argument. The Bible, we what's like the Bible. It has a lot of narrative, and the idea is that you can learn deep, profound truths through narrative. And I hope that my narrative helps open up some people's eyes to the truth.
So one of the real strengths of narrative, whether it's biblical or our own narratives, is narratives are really complicated. They offer
Yeah.
space for a lot of nuance and many facets. And one of the themes that I came away with from your book, and you say it explicitly a number of places, your book takes what is our human inclination to make things really simple
Yeah.
and offers a far more complicated view. Your
Yeah.
father, perfect central example
Yeah.
in this book. As a young person, you had a very simple, maybe one or two dimensional view of your father.
Yeah.
And by the end, when you're talking about speaking at his funeral, you have a far more complicated vision of who he is and was.
Yeah.
And that permeates all kinds of facets of the book. Another example, and again, you're explicit about this, is you talk about how a lot of Americans have a very simple understanding of the Black American experience.
Yeah.
And throughout your book, you complicate that simple story.
Yeah.
So let's begin here. How would you define the simple story or the simple explanation that too many Americans have
Yeah.
of the Black American experience?
I want to take your two things in turn, because you actually captured two really important themes in the book. Maybe I'll answer your second question, because then maybe we'll turn back to my father. I'll start with my father, then we'll go to the second question. My father was abusive. I mean, he was an addict, and he left our family. And despite those things that occurred, me and my siblings managed to get an education. Many of us escaped poverty. We kind of made our way into the middle class. And the simple way of telling our story is to cast him as the villain and ourselves as the hero. Because that's the story that America likes to hear. Like, we love the story of the overcomer. And so in an easy story, telling of my story, I will be the star. But I'm actually not the star of Pathway to the Promised Land. In fact, my father's the star, but it may be my mother. They're the central figures. The complicated, and so in the first part of the book, when you meet my father, you meet him as I understood him as a child. And so the first chapter is called The Making of a Villain. Now, I don't want to go into everything that happens after that, but what happens in the second half of the book, you meet my father as I understood him as an adult. And it doesn't necessarily erase the bad things that people do, but one of the things that I say is that sometimes villains aren't just, they don't just come into existence. They're created and shaped by their own experiences and their own trauma. And so trying to understand, and not only that, not only the fact that my father isn't simply just a villain, he was just evil. It was that my father was struggling to become something. And even if he doesn't succeed in becoming this kind of good and holy and just person, that struggle that he went through, or the struggle that a bunch of characters in the book go through to make something of their lives, is themselves instructive. In other words, we feel like we can only learn something from the people who succeed, as we define success. And I want to say, no. There's something about the straining towards something more, even amongst broken and complicated people, that reveals something about America. And so this gets to the American part. The simple discussion of race in America is America's racist, and that's the reason why African Americans don't experience enough success. And that some of us overcome racism, and that the key to overcoming racism is to work really, really hard to defeat the injustices of society. And some of us will make it. It's kind of like, I call it the Horatio Alger story dipped in chocolate, with racism and poverty mixed together that we have to fight our way through. But the truth is the following. There's a couple of things that are left out of that story. One is that African Americans aren't just acted upon, we're actors. That we are moral agents who make decisions, and sometimes we harm one another. And so there tends to be in society either the personal responsibility crowd, that all failures are rooted in failure, personal responsibility, or it's structural people. It's all structures of society. And in my own life, there was a mixture of both of those things. You said the reason that my father and structural racism are central characters in the story is because these are two things that were in the way of my own success. And so understanding that Black struggle is more than just what is done to us on the outside, but that we're moral agents who make our own decisions and stumble this way and that. And the other thing that I want to get at is that when we begin to think about then what kind of America do we want to create? Are we comfortable with an America in which enough people win the game to kind of tamp down on our guilt, Or do we want a society where people have enough room and space to stumble around and find themselves? One of the things that shocked me, maybe this is not shocking to anybody, but it was shocking to me, is that when I got to college, I went from an all-black high school to an all-white college. And getting out of that neighborhood and kind of getting an education and all those things, it was work. So I felt like I had arrived. It was like this tremendous accomplishment. And I took college seriously because I was one of the first in my family to make it. And I said, it's amazing I'm here. And so I thought that everybody worked that hard to get to college. Even if you were an athlete in my neighborhood, you were in practice every day. You were grinding in your own way. I got to college and realized, wait a minute, you could have been a C student if your parents just had $40,000 to pay for tuition. There's a legacy admission because your grandparents went here and they put money on a building. You get to just come to college. I was like, well, hold on. My grandparents were in Jim Crow. And so I never understood this idea that you could just be an ordinary person and not take life seriously until you're thinking, well, I'm going to party all the way through college. And maybe after that, I'll go get a job in my granddad's business or something. And that idea, and I'm not mad at the people who are able to stumble around and make it, but I said, there just wasn't that kind of margin of error in my community. You couldn't stumble around. And so for me, I was like, well, hold on. Maybe justice isn't the most exceptional black person surviving. Maybe justice is mediocre black people going to college like everybody else. Like, in other words, black knuckleheads who can mess around and then find themselves. And in my community, you just didn't have that space to mess around. And so what I wanted to do was to create an imaginative world where justice isn't, we have some exceptions. We've created a society where black teenagers can be black teenagers. One of the things I say to my son all of the time when he's meandering around our community, I say, listen, son, you are a black teenager. What your friends do and the bad ideas that they have, you might not be able to do that because you might not get that same amount of leeway. And so what I'm trying to get at then and how far to the promised land is the requirements that are placed upon black lives that I think are fundamentally unjust.
Okay, so let me back up because there's so much to... I wish I could spend hours talking. We need to get together offline and talk more about this since we're
we are
local.
We're, for the reader or the listener, we are 10 minutes from each other recording a podcast. I can walk over there. Let's go to the, what's it called? The Half the Sky and get some coffee after this.
Yeah, I mean, as I read this book last night, I was like, I'm so grateful you're local because there's so much more I want to talk to you about. Okay, going back to your father. And just, I mean, so much of this book is about your mother, your father, and generations before them. And one of the things that resonated so strongly with me is it feels like the journey you went on, although the particulars of our stories are very, very different, it's a journey that a lot of us have to go on, just learning to view our parents as adult children. Yeah. And recognizing that the simple view we had of our parents as children is way more complicated as we get to adulthood. For some of us, we had idealized views of our parents as kids. And as we become adults, we realize, oh, wait a minute, maybe they're not as perfect as we thought. And they do have shortcomings and problems and, wounds or whatever. With your father, it was the opposite. You saw him as a villain early on, as you talk about in the book, and you came to a far more nuanced and compassionate and fully formed view of him as an adult. But then you take that, as you did earlier, and transfer that understanding to America as a whole. Yeah. And some of us have a very juvenile understanding of our country. Yeah. And in some cases, it's a one-dimensional, heroic vision of America that as we get older and study the history and look at it more carefully, we realize, oh, well, wait a minute. Maybe it's not as virtuous as I thought. Maybe there is an underside or a darkness or a brokenness to this country that I need to acknowledge. For other people, they have an entirely negative view of America, just a villain. And they need to grow into a more nuanced understanding of realizing, it's more complicated than that. There are some virtues here that I need to recognize well. But all that complication, it feels like everything in our society is designed to delay or prevent that nuanced complication and wants to keep us all locked in a single dimension. Everyone is wearing a black hat or a white hat. It's all good or bad. It's all virtuous or evil. What do you think moves us, and what can help move especially Christians into that more mature adult vision of everything, not just the country or our parents?
I would just say that our desire for simplicity permeates everything. And it permeates
Yeah.
every aspect of our society, even writing. And I don't want to posit like this book as like the solution to the world's problems, because it's not. But what I resisted was that simplicity. And people want, like you said, that the villain and the hero. Because you know why? Because it's easy on the reader, or it's easy on the audience. If you tell me who the bad guy is, all I have to do is yell at the bad guy and cheer on the good guy. And the emotions
Right, that's our
required of
politics
me,
today.
The emotions required of me are very, very simple. Now, for me, one of the things that I'll say, and this relates to America and my family and all of these things together. One of the things that happens when you experience deep trauma or disappointment, it may start in your family, or it may start with the country, or it may start with the church, but it often kind of escalates into the question of God. Because if your family's messed up, or your country's messed up, or whatever it is you put some hope in, and you experience the disappointment, the question that you ask is, well, where is God in all of this? How can a good God allow these things to kind of come about? I spoke about in the book that any African American who knows any history begins to ask the question of theodicy, the problem of evil, and whether a good God can be there. And so
Actually, I want to. Can I quote that part of your book for a second?
I'm going to answer the
back
question.
To yourself, Esau.
Yeah. Okay. Then go ahead. Quote me back to myself.
Okay. No. Page 15. I marked that part of the book. Page 15. You say there's no black faith that doesn't wrestle with the problem of evil. And then page 16, you talk about as a boy praying to God, trying to rescue you from some of the circumstances you were facing. And then you write this: in those prayers, God came to me not with logical explanations of the problem of evil, but with his presence. When I prayed, a sensation of warmth that began in my chest moved throughout my body. The room seemed less empty. The lack of a speedy deliverance frustrated and perplexed me, but I never doubted my experience of God.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, again, so beautifully written. As a pastor, as a minister, as a theologian, how do you take that and apply it to where we are today with so many people deconstructing whether the faith or their family or the country?
How
does that play out?
That's what I'm saying is, for me, the questions begins with my family rose up to be questions of God. And for me, the real reason, one of the reasons why I stayed Christian, there's a bunch of them, but as a child, I stayed a Christian because God was there. And that may be like emotionally unsatisfying. But what I say to people is, modern European humanism wasn't helping me in my neighborhood when I was 8 years old. Like in other words, like this, that idea that we should, whatever that is, right? Whatever that secular idea wasn't in Northwest Huntsville. God was there. And the testimony from my family across generations was that God was there. And so for me, it was God was the one who made those things survivable. And one of the things I wanted to get at in the book is, well, what kind of miracle do we want? And one of the things that I prayed for a lot, and this is kind of a key theme in the book, is the miracle of immediate deliverance does not often occur. Doesn't even occur all of the time in the Bible. Good people die, right? Paul escapes prison and he runs around, but Paul's eventually martyred, right? And so it's not like God lets Paul out of prison and Paul dies of an old age. Paul gets out of prison. Paul gets his head chopped off in the end. And so this idea that God is only good when he rescues you from your circumstance is a functional denial of the resurrection. But if I believe there's a God who orders history, and I believe that Jesus Christ died and was risen on the third day, then I have a future, and not a future that detaches me from this world, but a future that makes this world livable. And for whatever reason, it's a gift from my mom and from my parents, my grandparents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, is that hope that just a little while longer now carried me through those difficult points in my life. And what the way that I was able to begin to forgive my father, and even the reason that I want to have some hope for America, are related. And they're related in this idea. When I began to see my father, not just as someone who inflicted trauma upon me, but a person whose life was hurtling towards a tragedy. Then I was able to find some space for sympathy. So, for example, if my father wasn't my father and he came to me as a pastor or as a clergy person and said, I'm estranged from my children, I made a mess of my life, and now the woman that I love wants nothing to do with me, and I've been on drugs for 30 years, I would say, that sounds horrible. But even now, you could begin again if you begin to change your life. And so I would, for every other person on the planet, probably beside my father, I would hope for some kind of turning. I would hope for some kind of redemption. And I began to realize that I could not talk about grace for the rest of the world and then deny it to people close to me. So it didn't mean that like our relationship became simple or that I just said the things that you did didn't matter. It wasn't saying that I was going to get the things that I lost back. It was, I don't want your life story to be added to die estranged from everyone that he knows. And when you begin to say the same thing about America, you begin to look at our country and say, we have ruined things. Like we did, well, I didn't do it. The white parts of America did chattel slavery and they did Jim Crow, did the civil rights movement. And if that story ends, right? And the church was complicit in so much of that stuff. If the story actually ends, well, in the late 90s to early 2000s, they thought about racial justice for about 15 years. And then they got afraid of wokeness and they slid back into racial animus. And then like Christianity just dies in America. Well, that's pretty sad. That's difficult because I see the spiritual carnage that leaves in the lives of other people. So I need the church in America to do better because for good or bad, people's real spiritual lives are impacted by the things that the American church does. So I don't have the freedom to just say that none of this stuff matters and cast it to the side. So for example, a lot of black Christians are being, I'll say it this way. This might get me into trouble. Here's my first get myself into trouble moment in your podcast. Because I've been annoyed by this for a long time. I think that some black Christians we're being manipulated because our rightful anger at the failures of certain segments of the church, including evangelicalism, has been used by people who don't actually love us to drive us from God. And so the collapsing of this is what kind of the far right of white evangelicalism believes, so this is what God is like, it's causing people to have all kinds of spiritual questions. And one of the things that's not been easy to do, it's been the constant struggle of black Christians through time, is to separate the evils of American Christianity from the thing itself. And I'm convinced that the thing itself remains beautiful. So for example, and I'll give you like a concrete example. If we do something like tie the idea that the scripture is the word of God to our good, if we tie scriptural inspiration to white supremacy, we all say white supremacy is bad and white supremacists like the Bible, therefore we should get rid of the Bible. That idea is, I think, damaging to the lives of black and brown people. And so part of what I want to say is, in my own writing, in my own life, it's like, yes, there are people who have profoundly misused this tradition, but I think there's still glory in it and a point towards that glory. But and that's the reason why, for me, hopelessness is a luxury that I do not have. If I actually care about the flourishing of my people, and I think the flourishing of my people is tied to God's providential ordering of history.
In the chapter where you talk about your college experiences, almost entirely white college in the South, and you encounter white liberals for the first time in a significant way, and they seem to jettison any idea of Christian faith as being of value. And you, from your own inheritance, from your family and the generations you talk about in this book, you realize that can't be true. But you had to figure out what was the role of the black church in this thing. Without going too deep into this, because it opened up a whole nother can of worms, how do you make sense then of all the statistics that are coming out that are showing younger African Americans today are far less attached to the church than our generation was, or the generations before us, especially the civil rights generation, where it was the hub of that movement? Well, what do you do, or how do you feel about that diminishment?
I think that one of the things that I tried to do in that chapter is to talk about the options that are available to a Black Christian when they arrive in white spaces. And one of the options are you can just immerse yourself in white evangelicalism. But part of the cost of that is that some of the key kind of the theological and spiritual distinctives of the Black church you have to jettison. And one of those is the combination of orthodoxy and orthopraxy, right belief and right practice, the concern for the poor and the marginalized. Like that, you just get labeled. I mean, I don't know any Black Christian, and you can probably, here's another thing name me one Black Christian who's spoken about race and justice who does it right. We're always seen as the ones who do it wrong. And we always treat with suspicion no matter what we believe about the Bible. And so that fatigue of being under suspicion because you care about the poor and the disinherited gets exhausting in certain evangelical spaces. But it's also the case that it's just simply demonstrably true. And you can look at every statistic that you want to have. If you look at the practice, the ideas about prayer, Bible reading, church attendance, beliefs, that Black Christians are pretty traditional. And so that
we've talked about that a lot on this show.
Yeah, that robust affirmation of the goodness of God and the need to trust in His Word often sits uneasy with a secular progressivism that likes what we say about justice but don't like what we have to say about Jesus. And so that means that the African American Christian is often pushed to sacrifice a key part of themselves. And that's part of what I experienced in college. And so what I think that sometimes evangelical Christians latch on to that, but what they want to do when we critique kind of progressivism is say, oh, well, you should just be like the Black conservative. No. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about like becoming like your token Black person who's conservative on the things you want to be. No. What I'm trying to say is that as I listen to some of the cultural and social analysis, I agree. I agree that society is often unjust towards people. I agree that the marginalized are often stepped upon. I agree that there's economic and political exploitation and all of these things. I believe those things. But I believe them because I'm a Christian. And I believe them because I read with the grain of the Bible and not against it. And so that struggle to kind of find yourself is this constant churning that is going on was going on in my heart. I think it goes on in the hearts of lots of African Americans. Now, as it relates to the idea of people being de-churched, we're Black people are humans, right? We're not special in the sense of like separated from the human experience. We're going through a rapidly secularizing culture with lots of opportunities and other things that are clamoring for our attention. And so, of course, there's going to be some spiritual impact of that. And what I want to say too is, and I don't want to remove agency, but I want to say something. Here's the question. What happens when there's 75 years of what I just described in Black churches? Let's say if you're African American at any point from 1950 to 2023, it's like 73 years, right? Where are we going to be educated that affirms who we are theologically, spiritually, and culturally as relates to our belief in social issues? So we've had to choose parts of ourselves depending what school we went to do and cobble together some spirituality. So the long train of that, 3 generations of Black clergy who are all trained having to choose one or the other, make up for what is lacking, and then return to their communities and do ministry is important. The other thing that is also actually happening, and this is reality, is integration. And I'm not saying integration was great, by the way. Like I'm pro integration, so don't hear this in the wrong way. But seriously, there are some African Americans who the integration wasn't like the best, but I think the Bible says we should all be in one family. But in the 1960s, there was I think it's something like 92% of all African Americans went to HBCUs. And then by currently, I think it's like 92 to 92% of African Americans, I could get the statistics wrong, something like 90% of Black people now go to majority white institutions. So you go from this place of going from your Black community to a Black college, to a seminary, and then back into the Black community where there was kind of a sense of cultural cohesion. Rooted in racism, white supremacy is why we couldn't do it, but it actually happened. Now, when you go into the majority of white institutions, well, then there's a bunch of spiritual trauma. And then they go into a variety of churches where sometimes they have good experiences, bad experiences that lead to all kinds of issues. Now, I obviously think that we should be in multicultural churches. I think that those things are good. I think the black churches are good and multicultural churches are good as well. But that creates also its own kind of complicated reality of we're now navigating experiences where there's a real danger of racial and spiritual trauma if we are in places that that wanted our picture for the diversity, but not the true reality of who we are. And the other thing that actually happened is this was like largely what they call it a brain drain in many African American communities, because the people who a lot of multi-ethnic churches wanted to get were the educated black middle class who are also living in those same suburbs. And so there's a lot of reasons why the spiritual lives of black Christians in the present day are complicated. And I think that what I'm saying is the Bible has a vision of every tribe and nation worshiping God. And I think there's something about the multi-ethnic church that points towards the eschatological reality of the Christian hope. But I also want to say there is real trauma inflicted upon ethnic minorities when they're in a space in which the people in power won't suffer alongside of them. And the inability and the unwillingness to suffer alongside of them sometimes causes real pain and difficulty.
Well, I mean, this all just reinforces what we began with, which is the need to see the complexity of these things. It's easy to say that a multi-ethnic community is just simply good.
Yeah.
And it is good, but there's complications.
Yeah.
There's complexities. There's shadow sides to these goods that we need to be aware of and look at. Before we run out of time, I want to go back to the personal side of your book again. Early on, you mentioned your father passing away, and I think it was your mother who made the comment that your father spent his whole life trying to prove a dead man wrong, which comes out later in the book, where you reference the trauma he had experienced from his father, your grandfather, and the impact that had on his life. Toward the end of the book, you're talking about your own identity as a father, and you have 4 kids, and how you go to their games the way your father didn't, and you give them hugs, and you're present and engaged. And I don't have it underlined here, but you made some comment about how much are you doing that because you're just reacting to your experience and to not be like your father.
Yeah.
And that just brings up for me, are we, I don't want to say doomed, but it's probably too strong, but are we just locked into what we've inherited, good and bad, from the generations before us? Is there this unbreakable inertia of generations that we live with? Or is there hope that inertia, whether we're reacting positively or negatively to what we've received, where does grace fit into that?
I think that that's one of the things I'm wrestling with in the book. And I want to say it is impossible not to be impacted by your past, but you don't have to be defined by it. And one of the things that happens is, at least for me, for a long time, the stories that are in the book are the stories that I return to over and over again. They were kind of stuck on repeat in my brain. And we all have these moments where we kind of relive our past over and over. I wish I had said this. I wish I had done this. I wish I had gone this way. And what I figured out is I can't undo the past, but I can end the past. I can write an ending to it. I can say, what I wish I had said was this, or what I wish I had known was this, and this is the proper way to respond. In other words, I felt like it was impossible for me to escape it, but I could end it. And the reason that I needed to end or bring some closure to it was precisely so that I might chart a different path for my children. And one of the things that became clear to me, there's the last section of the book is called Ordinary Glory. And I talk about this idea that when I was a kid, I thought I would be the perfect dad because I knew what not to do. I would be at everything or do everything perfectly. But the longer that I lived, I realized I'm not my father. I don't abuse my children. But I can't be the perfect dad. I can feel my own humanity. And I realized that no matter how much I love my children, I can't love them perfectly. But then I said, you know what? What I really needed was not a perfect dad, but an ordinary one. And so my goal now isn't to be the perfect father, but to be an ordinary father who points them towards something. So in other words, I want to give my children less to recover from and more room for them to be the person that God created them to be. Like, I know, like, one of the things is really that you realize once you get old enough is that at a certain point, like when you graduate from college, you get like your report cards, you get the grades, right? But at a certain point, I realized my children are going to assess my parenting. Right? They're going to say, this is what you did. Like, it's going to be a settled opinion. I'm not going to be able to argue them out of it. Like, this is what you did well, this is what you did poorly. And it doesn't matter how good of a parent you are. Everybody has issues with the way they were parented. Every single person I met does.
Yep.
And what I want my kids to say is, my father was imperfect, but he loved us. And he loved us in such a way that it gave us room to find ourselves and not simply overcome his traumas. And so How Far to the Promised Land is my way of trying to finish those stories and open up a better path for my children. But also, once again, that idea that if we can own the truth about what America is, we can end those stories, not in the sense of not being impacted by them, but use what we learned from them to chart a different future.
Well, as I finished your book last night, I thought to myself, you've given your children a great gift just by writing this book, to codify these stories of their ancestors going back generations, and having their father's story in this way is going to be really valuable to them as they reach adulthood. And it sounds like to me, a lot of what you've done in this book and what you just described, you hope your own kids do, that's what it means to honor our mother and father, right? Yeah. It's not to have an idealistic vision of who they are, but it's to see them as fully human, the good, the bad, the ugly, and honor them and their story enough to recognize their journey and the grace that was in it. And not to repeat it, maybe to end that story and to live our own, but to honor it. And your book, I keep saying the word beautiful, but what I was so grateful for is this book is not about grievance. It's about, it's ultimately about gratitude. And it's just a compelling and fantastic story. And even though many people will read it and not identify with all the specifics of your story, there's so much that's applicable to all of us, regardless of where we are. And that makes for just a fantastic memoir. Esau, we're going to get together. We're going to go get something to drink over at my half of the sky. We'll talk more about this. But thank you so much. Everybody, you need to go get How Far to the Promised Land. The subtitle is One Black Family's Story of Hope and Survival in the American South. Esau, thanks for being here.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Mike Strelo. Editing by Area Code Audio. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.